This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video on Paper 1 Psychopathology with a specific focus on the cognitive explanation of depression. To begin, we need to make sure that we are confident with the specification and where the cognitive approach of depression fits into the wider picture of psychopathology. So if you have a look here, it says the cognitive approach to explaining and treating depression. The explanations you will be expected to know, apply and evaluate are Beck's negative triad and Ellis's ABC model. You will also be expected to know and evaluate the treatments from a cognitive approach, which is cognitive behaviour therapy, including challenging irrational thoughts. So to be able to do that really effectively, you need to understand the approach that the cognitive approach takes in explaining human behaviour and then being able to link that to depression. So it all starts with this idea of cognitions, meaning thoughts, thought processes, ways of thinking. With the typical, you might have heard the saying, are you a glass half full or half empty type of person? And that saying is just basically centered around, well, how do you actually view the world that you live in? Are you quite an optimistic person who sees a glass as half full, as there being something in that glass that is worthwhile? Or are you the opposite in that the glass is half empty, that yes, there is something in there, but it's also half empty, there's not a lot in there, and being drawn to that sort of pessimistic view and seeing the negatives in a situation? So those key assumptions of the cognitive approach are that individuals who suffer from mental disorders have distorted and irrational thinking, which may cause maladaptive behaviour. So we've come across that word maladaptive in our definitions of abnormality for failing to function adequately. That defines abnormality as someone who is maladaptive. And maladaptive is basically negative, sort of damaging behaviour. So I've underlined those words, distorted and irrational. Irrational thinking is crucial, as we've just seen on the spec. CBT is about challenging those irrational thoughts. So if you can get to grips with that term at this stage, you'll be able to evaluate and discuss effectively the treatments for depression from the cognitive approach. So the cognitive approach suggests it's the way that you think about a problem rather than the problem itself, which leads to a mental disorder. And individuals can overcome mental disorders by learning to use more appropriate cognitions, so thoughts. And if people think in a more positive way, they can be helped to feel better. I'm an idiot, I'm so stupid. No, I'm not. I'm okay, actually. So this picture just demonstrates that sort of same idea with your glass half full, glass half empty. The way you view the world, but also the way you view yourself can have an impact on a person who's likely to develop a mental disorder. So there are two main cognitive explanations of depression, which believe that the disorder is a result of irrational or disturbance in thinking. Beck and Ellis both focus on individuals' negative thoughts, irrational beliefs, and misinterpretation of events as being the cause of depression. So if I just sort of highlight this bit for you, this helps us to identify a similarity between the two cognitive explanations of depression that you need to know. So both Beck and Ellis focus on thought patterns, irrational beliefs, and misinterpretation of events as causing depression. So the first explanation we're going to look at is Beck. Beck suggested that some people are more vulnerable to depression than others. Now, often when you see the word vulnerability, you might think biological predisposition, that's what makes someone vulnerable. But from Beck's point of view, this vulnerability is due to their cognitions, their thoughts. And Beck detailed 3 parts to the cognitive vulnerability. He said these individuals have faulty information processing, negative self-schemas, and the negative triad. So we're going to examine each of these 3 parts to the cognitive vulnerability now. So if you are making notes, you might want to put the cognitive vulnerability and Beck as your heading. And the first one we're going to get started on is faulty information processing in 3 seconds. So faulty information processing, according to Beck, is that people with depression attend to negative aspects of a situation and will ignore the positives. So that's the metaphor of the glass half full or half empty. There's also a tendency to blow small problems out of proportion, and people with depression tend to think in black and white terms. So they'll tend to the negative aspects of a situation, ignoring the positives, blow small problems out of proportion, and have black and white thinking. So you're either a success or a failure. Or people either really like you or really dislike you. Those sorts of thought patterns, being black and white, and being not able to see the middle ground, or actively choosing to ignore the middle ground. Moving on to the second element of Beck's theory, which is negative self-schemas. Schemas really important for paper 2 in approaches as well, from the cognitive approach, the role that schemas have, what a schema is, and the strengths and weaknesses of humans using schemas. Now, obviously, one of the downsides of schemas is that it can lead to mental illness, which is what Beck is outlining here. So a schema is a building block of knowledge. It's a package of information that we develop through experience. So a self-schema is that package of information that we hold about ourselves from our own experience with our own behaviour, but also our experience with others and what they might say or make us feel about our own behaviour. So Beck believes that people who become depressed have developed negative self-schemas. So they interpret all the information about themselves in a negative way. As you can see from the image, not talented enough, not good enough, not smart enough. So when we think about how the cognitive approach says misinterpreting events can lead to depression, this is where this negative self-schema really sort of sticks in. So not pretty enough. These comments, maybe one thing was made, maybe a friend commented on how tired the girl in the image looks, and these are all the negative self-schemas that emerge out of being just told that she maybe looks tired or doesn't look very well or doesn't seem herself. It might be that someone with depression sort of hooks on to those comments that aren't necessarily made with any malice or to cause any negative emotions, but those negative self-schemas, that experience then builds up and the individual interprets that information in a negative way. Combining these previous 2, so faulty information processing and negative self-schemas, Beck then puts forward the negative triad, which is the third and final element to Beck's theory. So the negative triad is Beck suggesting that people with depression then become trapped in a cycle of negative thoughts that then occur automatically. And that word automatically is really important here. So regardless of the reality in front of them, they will view themselves, the world, and the future in a negative, pessimistic way. So I've given examples here. Negative view of the self. I'm incompetent, I'm undeserving, or those negative self-schemas that we had on the previous slide. Not pretty enough, not talented enough. A negative view of the world. The world is a hostile place. The world is miserable. The world will never get better. The world is ending. Those negative views of the world. And then the negative view of the future. So those problems won't disappear. There's always going to be emotional pain. I'm always going to be ugly. I'm never going to be loved. They all lead to one another. Negative view of the self leads to a negative view of the future. Negative view of the future leads to a negative view of the world. Negative view of the world to a negative view of the self, and any direction you like. So that is why it's called a triad, because all 3 of those make up that automatic negative thought pattern. Now I'm going to move on to explain Ellis's theory, which is the second cognitive explanation of depression you all need to know and evaluate. So Ellis proposed that good mental health is the result of rational thinking. This allows people to be happy and free from pain. Therefore, depression results from irrational thoughts. So irrational thoughts are not illogical or unrealistic, but they are just thoughts that interfere with a person being happy and free from pain. For example, I must be successful, I must be competent, I must achieve excellently in everything I do if I'm to feel worthwhile. You know, an example that might be relatable is someone that puts that pressure on themselves to get A stars or A's in every assessment that they ever do. I must be successful, I must be competent, I must achieve that. And then, of course, it's not the event, it's not the getting the C grade in the assessment, it's not that actual event itself that causes the person to get those negative thoughts and emotions, but it's the individual themselves and how they interpret the events in an irrational way. So this one C grade is not going to affect their life chances, it's not going to stop them from going to university, but they might interpret it in that way, or it might not stop them from getting a job that they've just applied for, but they might interpret it in that negative way that it is detrimental, and so it completely irrational interpretation. The main part of Ellis's theory, though, is his ABC model, which is what we're about to look at now. So Ellis's ABC model, each letter of A, B, C stands for the sequential part of his model, starting with A, which is activating event. So this could be something like a breakup, an event that happens in the person's life, then could lead to that irrational belief, so B for belief. And in this context, it's no one will ever love me, my partner that I was just with didn't love me, or we wouldn't have broken up. And those irrational beliefs then lead to a negative emotional consequence. So C is for consequence. And that negative emotional consequence is depression, as Ellis believes. So Ellis believes that if a person spends a lot of time thinking irrationally and negatively, it becomes a habit. And habit is hard to break. So it's that bit which then leads to depression. So I'm going to leave this slide on for 5 seconds, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to apply your knowledge to some made up examples using the ABC model. Okay, so here we go. If you would like to pause the video, have a read over the examples and just gather your thoughts on what you think the activating event, irrational belief and negative emotional consequence are in each of the 3 or just one of the examples. So in 5 seconds, I will display the answers on the screen. Okay, there we go. You can check your ideas. So activating event, I've put in sort of a red maroony colour. The beliefs are in green and the consequence is in blue. So 5 seconds. Pause now if you wish, and in 5 seconds I'm going to move on. Okay, so we've had the opportunity to look at what the cognitive approach suggests about depression. We have outlined both Beck and Ellis's theories on depression, and now we will need to evaluate Beck and Ellis's approach to explaining depression as separate theories, in case you get an essay on just the one. And then we will also need to look at how we can evaluate the cognitive approach in a general sense. So for now, I'd like you to pause the video and have a think about each of Beck and Ellis's approaches. What might the strengths and weaknesses of these explanations be? In 5 seconds, we will go through the answers. So starting with Beck's theory. Beck's theory is very good because it has good supporting evidence. So a lot of research has supported this view that depression is a result of individuals having faulty information processes, negative self-schemas, and the triad of impairments. One thing I will say now that does apply to both Beck and Ellis's theories is that it's highly correlational. Are the thoughts the cause of depression, or are the thoughts an effect, a symptom of depression? So whilst we're going to say Beck's theory is very good as it has supporting evidence, we can also critique it in that way. However, still to this day, Beck's theory has practical application in cognitive behaviour therapy. It forms the basis of it. Cognitive aspects of depression are challenged in CBT. The therapist acts as a scientist alongside the patient, and they are encouraged, the patient is encouraged to view situations more rationally. And that has been found to reduce symptoms in people with depression. So not only does it have evidence of the link between irrational thoughts and depression, but also the practical application offers massive value to Beck's theory. On the other hand, however, the weaknesses are that it does not explain all aspects of depression, because it explains basic symptoms, negative thoughts, not liking yourself, not liking the future. But depression is a much more complex disorder than that, with a whole range of symptoms that can't be explained simply through irrational thoughts or a negative self-schema. So evaluation of Ellis's theory. Got one strength and one weakness here. The weakness is that it only offers a partial explanation. Ellis's theory focuses on this activating event leading to irrational beliefs, which then lead to negative emotional consequences. However, that's a really great explanation for what we call reactive depression, which does occur out of an activating event, but not all depression arises from an obvious case or an obvious cause. So this is known as endogenous depression. Endogenous to sort of represent that internal depression that could be a result of a biological vulnerability, a biological predisposition, and not an external activating event. Not every single person that suffers with depression has an activating event that they can link their negative emotions and negative thoughts to. So this is a massive drawback of Ellis's theory. On the other hand, Ellis does have a lot of practical value. His practical application in rational emotive behavioural therapy, which is what I said previously in the video, in terms of the therapist working alongside the patient as a scientist, where they critique or vigorously argue with a depressed person and discuss how these irrational beliefs make them unhappy and how they can adjust them. And the evidence has found that rational emotive behavioural therapy can actually change those negative beliefs in a person and relieve the symptoms of depression. So his theory has massive practical value and helps to improve the quality of people's lives. So that's the evaluation of Ellis's theory. The last thing we are going to do as part of this video is look at some broader evaluations that can be used for the cognitive approach to depression generally, or to sort of be used in relation to Beck and Ellis as well. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and to think about how you could evaluate the cognitive explanation of depression. Think about the answers to these two questions, and in 5 seconds' time I will go through the answers. So both of these evaluation points have been touched upon throughout the video, starting with this idea that it is reductionist and there are alternative explanations to depression, the biological view, the biological vulnerability, even the environment, and also this idea that negative thoughts might not actually be the cause of the depression, but the effect, the symptoms of depression. So looking at these points in a bit more detail, depression that comes from nowhere might be better explained by innate biological processes. For example, women's hormones that can make them feel down and depressed. And the biological approach also suggests that genes and neurotransmitters may cause depression. So there is a link between the neurotransmitter serotonin in the human brain that is actually linked to depression. And the biological treatment for depression is centered around selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, otherwise known as SSRIs, which are a form of antidepressant and increase levels of serotonin in the brain and therefore reduce depressive symptoms. So there are other causes to depression aside from the cognitive ones. Therefore, a diathesis stress model might be a better approach because individuals with a genetic vulnerability might be more prone to the effects of living in a negative environment, which then might cause their irrational thinking. So there could actually be a link between biology, cognition, and environment, rather than just solely saying thoughts are the cause. There clearly is an interaction between the environment in which an individual might filter through the negative information, but the environment can also play a part rather than just the person's thoughts. So that is the end of the cognitive explanation to depression. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.